The Unexpurgated Pike Report. Forward by Philip Agee. Report of the House Select Committee on Intelligence, 1976. Publisher's Note. The Pike Committee report includes extensive footnotes. The footnotes are too substantial to be both included here and maintain the listenable narrative. Thus, the footnotes were excluded from this audiobook version. Interested listeners can find them in the original PDF version of the report available on archive.org. 1. The Select Committee's Oversight Experience. If this committee's recent experience is any test, intelligence agencies that are to be controlled by congressional lawmaking are, today, beyond the lawmakers' scrutiny. These secret agencies have interests that inherently conflict with the open accountability of a political body, and there are many tools and tactics to block and deceive conventional congressional checks. Added to this are the unique attributes of intelligence, notably national security in its cloak of secrecy and mystery, to intimidate Congress and erode fragile support for sensitive inquiries. Wise and effective legislation cannot proceed in the absence of information respecting conditions to be affected or changed. Nevertheless, under present circumstances, inquiry into intelligence activities faces serious and fundamental shortcomings. Even limited success in exercising future oversight requires a rethinking of the powers, procedures, and duties of the overseers. This committee's path and policies, its pluses and minuses, may at least indicate where to begin. A. Access to information. The key to exercising oversight is knowledge. In the case of intelligence agencies, this translates into a need for access to information often held by the agencies themselves about events in distant places. It is an uncertain approach to gathering facts, given the best of circumstances. The best of circumstances thereby become a minimum condition. The Select Committee's most important work may well have been its test of those circumstances, testing perhaps for the first time what happens when Congress unilaterally decides what it wants to know and how it wants to know it. There were numerous public expressions by intelligence agencies and the executive that full cooperation would be accorded. The credibility of such assurances was important, since almost all the necessary materials were classified and controlled by the executive branch. Despite these public representations, in practice, most document access was preceded by lengthy negotiations. Almost without exception, these negotiations yielded something less than complete or timely access. In short, the words were always words of cooperation. The reality was delay, refusal, missing information, asserted privileges, and on and on. The committee began by asserting that Congress alone must decide who, acting on its behalf, has a right to know secret information. This led to a rejection of executive clearances or the compartmentation of our staff. The committee refused, as a matter of policy, to sign agreements. It refused to allow intelligence officials to read and review our investigators' notes and avoided canned briefings in favor of primary source material. The committee maintained that Congress has a right to all information short of direct communications with the President. Our ability to abide by these policies was a mixed record. On the plus side, an aggressive pursuit of facts and a willingness to support this pursuit with subpoenas produced some unprecedented results. As an example, never before had either the executive or Congress put together a 10-year review of covert action projects. By subpoena, which unfortunately had to be taken to the brink of contempt enforcement, the staff of the committee analyzed all official covert action approvals since 1965 and reported its results to the committee in a closed hearing. That presentation was one of the more interesting and accurate pictures of U.S. covert policies yet assembled, and was of no small value to our findings. Other examples appear throughout the remainder of this report. Nonetheless, if that is the positive side, it was offset by the extraordinary efforts that were required, even in a climate favorable to reviewing past executive conduct, to identify and obtain documents. It is a commentary in itself that subpoenas were necessary. It is a further commentary that much of the time subpoenas were not enough, and only a determined threat of contempt proceedings brought grudging results. 1. Delay. The record of subpoenas is worth reviewing. It began on August 5, 1975, when an Assistant Secretary of Defense was asked to appear as a witness and bring with him the document by which the National Security Agency, NSA, was set up. It was a simple and logical request. The Defense Department controls NSA. The committee was holding hearings on intelligence budgets. NSA has the biggest budget, and the committee wanted to see the authority by which the NSA operates. The official did not bring the document. He did not have clearance to. For this elementary piece of information, the Select Committee was forced to resort to the first of its many subpoenas. It is worth noting that the subpoena was promptly honored, which raises the question why the document was not delivered in the first place. By late August, the committee was preparing for hearings to review what kind of intelligence our money buys. 4 events were chosen for hearings: the 1973 Mideast War, the 1974 Cyprus coup, the 1974 Portuguese coup, and the 1968 Tet Offensive in Vietnam. During August and early September, there were repeated requests for documents and interviews. In some cases, we were given heavily sanitized pieces of paper. Sanitized was simply a euphemism for blank sheets of paper with a few scattered words left in, often illegible, sometimes misleading, and usually inconclusive. In some cases, notably as to the 1974 coup in Portugal, there was an absolute refusal to provide anything. As a last-ditch effort, with hearings approaching, the committee turned once more to its subpoena power. On September 10, 1975, it subpoenaed materials from the 3 major intelligence agencies and the National Security Council. What were the materials that forced the committee to resort to the force of law? Were they the names of agents? No. In fact, the committee never once asked for the names of covert agents. Were they descriptions of secret intelligence techniques? No. They were simply copies of intelligence publications that had been circulated in the executive branch during the week preceding the events that we were examining. Documents circulated literally to hundreds, if not thousands, of people. Were they turned over by the date specified in the subpoena? No. The 3 intelligence agencies supplied bits and pieces of the publications. Dr. Kissinger, an assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, refused to turn over a single piece of paper from reports provided to the National Security Council during the weeks in question. By the time hearings on intelligence results began in mid-September, only one agency had substantially complied with our subpoena. More than a month would pass before a good faith effort at compliance was forthcoming from the National Security Council. 2. Cutoff. This problem was soon dwarfed by a new tactic, the cutoff. On September 12, 1975, the President, or someone using his name, cut off the committee from all classified information. As if that were not enough, his action was accompanied by a demand that we immediately turn over all classified materials from our internal files. The reason? The Congress, through this committee, had passed judgment, after lengthy deliberation of the merits, on whether 4 words classified by the executive branch could be told to the American people. The executive, by its legally questionable reaction, had now set aside any immediate subpoena problems, and public hearing problems as well. As background, a hearing on September 11, 1975, had reviewed intelligence performance with respect to the Mideast War in 1973. The result was shocking. In the words of a CIA document, quote, "The principal conclusions concerning the imminence of hostilities reached and reiterated by those responsible for intelligence analysis were, quite simply, obviously, and starkly, wrong." End quote. That same document had verbatim quotes from 2 intelligence bulletins that were moderately favorable and from 5 bulletins demonstrating that intelligence estimates were embarrassingly wrong. The 2 favorable quotes were declassified and read into the record. The 5 embarrassing quotes, containing the same type of information, were not declassified by CIA. The committee objected. The CIA returned that afternoon to report that, after all, the 5 quotes could be declassified. However, in an apparent need not to appear arbitrary in their earlier decision, they still insisted that some 13 words still remain classified. The committee debated those 13 words for over 4 hours in a closed session. The CIA special counsel was present and in telephone contact with CIA Director Colby. The head of the State Department's Intelligence and Research was there, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency was there, and a high official of the National Security Agency was there. No agency was without representation, and all had a chance to speak. 9 words were mutually agreed to remain classified, but 4 words were not. The 4 remaining words could not reveal any secret sources and methods, which is the basis of official classifications, because the information they contained could have come from any number of sources. In addition, the intelligence was so old by the time it was reported that it could not reveal how rapidly our intelligence techniques operated. The committee satisfied itself on these and other points before taking some half-dozen roll call votes on the matter. It is possible that never before had so much expertise and thought gone into a declassification decision. For this, the committee was accused of being irresponsible. To protect national security, the president invoked a cutoff, perhaps before the president ever heard of what was going on. The committee later learned that in a biography of Dr. Kissinger a year earlier, the subject to which the 4 words referred had been spelled out in great detail. So much for the validity of the classification argument. No high State Department official had been cut off from information or forced to turn over his files as a result of that earlier publication. So much for protecting against irresponsibility. Police guarding committee offices were instructed to prevent any takeover of files by the executive, and nothing more was heard of that. Nevertheless, the cutoff from information struck at the heart of committee operations. 1 month out of our 5-month investigative period was lost while the issue was negotiated. With little choice, the committee agreed that for purposes of getting the investigation underway again, future disputes would be referred to the president. This was agreed to on the assurance of the president that the committee would have no further problem with access to information. It is perhaps significant that the day the committee was cut off was also the day hearings were scheduled on the 1974 Cyprus coup. Hearings were to be focused on the State Department's handling of intelligence and of Dr. Kissinger's role therein. Those hearings had to be canceled. However, the committee located a State Department witness who was eager to testify about Cyprus, even in the absence of classified evidence from the executive. His name was Thomas Boyat. Thomas Boyat was the State Department officer in charge of the Cyprus desk during the period in question. The committee was interested in what kind of intelligence had been supplied to Boyat regarding the 1974 coup against Archbishop Makarios and the consequent Turkish invasion. More important, the committee wanted to examine how that intelligence, as well as Mr. Boyat's analysis of it, was handled by decision-makers at State. Mr. Boyat had, in fact, advised the committee staff that he vigorously criticized the handling of intelligence at the time of the Cyprus crisis. This criticism was embodied in a written report which was sent through the State Department's dissent channels, and it led to a whole new series of problems. 3. Silenced witnesses. In response to the committee's interest in Thomas Boyat's intelligence critique, a new tactic was fashioned: the silenced witness. On September 22, 1975, Mr. Boyat was ordered by the State Department not to tell the committee, quote, information which would disclose options considered by or recommended to more senior officers in the department, end quote. The order was added on to the existing ban on classified information. That was not the end. anything Mr. Boyott did say would have to be in the presence of State Department monitors by order of the Secretary. It is worth pointing out that this prohibition extended to more than Mr. Boyott's options or advice. Any information that would disclose those options was also banned. An attempted interview by the staff with monitors demonstrated that this covered almost everything the man ever did or said. The State Department's order was issued in spite of 2 United States laws which protect and guarantee the right of a federal employee to provide information to Congress. One statute says that the right of a federal employee, quote, to furnish information to either House of Congress or to a committee or member thereof may not be interfered with or denied, end quote. The second law, which directly bears on the Boyott situation, was specifically designed to encourage candid testimony of employees from federal agencies, including the Department of State. The authority invoked by the Secretary of State was neither classification nor executive privilege, but a new doctrine that can best be characterized as secretarial privilege. The Secretary of State was demanding special treatment. If this committee could not have received testimony from CIA officers or FBI agents about advice or options they presented to senior officials, it would have no choice but to shut down. Oversight would be dead. Fortunately, the CIA, the FBI, and other intelligence agencies had either not heard of secretarial privilege or did not believe it existed. On October 2, 1975, the committee voted to issue a subpoena for Mr. Boyott's Cyprus critique. Dr. Kissinger responded on October 14, 1975, referring to the subpoena as a request. It was denied, even though it was not a request but a legal order to produce a document. Time and control are, as we noted at the outset, in the hands of those who have possession of documents. Therefore, the committee, more than 1 month after issuing its subpoena, accepted from Mr. Boyott no testimony and no document, but something less. We were given Mr. Boyott's memo after it had been mixed into a number of other paragraphs drafted elsewhere in the State Department, ostensibly to protect Mr. Boyott. It ended up very much like the proverbial riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. This time, the euphemism was an amalgam. 4. Flank attack. On September 24, 1975, 2 days after written instructions to Mr. Boyott were issued, the Deputy Secretary of State raised for the first time an innuendo that the committee's actions resembled McCarthyism. The committee's initial reaction was to dismiss any such inference as a temporary lapse into poor taste. Unfortunately, it was not a temporary lapse. The next day, on September 25, 1975, Deputy Secretary Eagleburger appeared before the committee to explain the Boyott order. His statement again referred to State Department employees' problems with Congress in past times, a clear reference to the McCarthy period of the 1950s, as his subsequent testimony made clear. On October 14, 1975, Dr. Kissinger's written response to the subpoena of Boyott's intelligence critique again raised a reference to McCarthyism. The implication was baseless, as both Mr. Eagleburger and Dr. Kissinger admitted under questioning. Facts seemed to make no difference. Within days of the innuendo being raised by Dr. Kissinger and his deputy, newspaper columns and editorials were reporting their charges of McCarthyism. To the extent that such media activity may have been inspired, directly or indirectly, by the State Department, it helped erode support within and outside the committee for pursuing the plain truth. With that erosion, the fiction of an amalgam became feasible. Someday the full story of Cyprus may be told, but not by this committee. If no flank attack was launched by the FBI to discredit the committee, it may have been because one was averted by the committee. On October 9, 1975, Mr. Martin Kaiser, a manufacturer of wiretap equipment, testified before the committee. He indicated that the FBI bought his equipment through a middleman, U.S. Recording Company, who added a 30% markup. There was no justification for the markup, and it later developed that the president of U.S. Recording and a top FBI official were close friends. The committee began an investigation of U.S. Recording and its FBI friends. The Justice Department and FBI later began their own probe of the same matter. On December 23, 1975, 2.5 months after Mr. Kaiser testified, he was subjected to a 6-hour interview by 2 FBI agents. The agents were allegedly carrying out an internal FBI investigation regarding the agency's contractual dealings with U.S. Recording Company. Mr. Kaiser called the committee to relay his concern and offered to give a statement under oath as to the conduct of the FBI agents. In a committee deposition of December 30, 1975, Kaiser claimed that the FBI agents were more concerned with discrediting the committee's inquiry and personnel than conducting their investigation of U.S. Recording. Ultimately, the agents had elicited from him a statement written by an FBI agent which in some insignificant details recanted portions of his testimony. Mr. Kaiser subsequently repudiated that written statement, which he had signed while agents stood over him and thrust it in front of him. Taking the initiative, the committee, on December 31, 1975, released a copy of the written statement, a full copy of Mr. Kaiser's December 30, 1975 deposition, and the text of a letter to the Attorney General demanding a full explanation of the entire incident. This was done to head off any FBI leak of the statement its agents had taken while Kaiser was under some duress. 5. Deletions. In early November, about the same time as the Boyott problems were being resolved, the committee moved on from the subjects of money and what our money buys. The third topic of its hearings was risks and how well those risks are controlled. 7 new subpoenas were issued. 4 were for materials pertaining to subjects of prior hearings. They were honored. The remaining 3 were directed to Dr. Kissinger for materials pertaining to upcoming hearings. Not surprisingly, those subpoenas went unanswered. Once again, some background is helpful. 2 of the 3 subpoenas were for covert action recommendations made by non-CIA officials, since the CIA had already opened up its covert action files to us. The third subpoena was for intelligence records on Soviet compliance with Strategic Arms Limitation Agreements, SALT. When considering risks, covert actions rank as perhaps the highest risk operations in the government, short of war. The law allows the CIA, quote, to perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the National Security Council may from time to time direct, end quote. This is the legal authority for covert action. A subcommittee of the National Security Council, presently called the 40 Committee, has been assigned the task of directing these actions. By tracing money, the committee came across millions of rounds of ammunition and weapons being purchased in the early 1970s. These purchases were destined for a questionable military venture in a far-off war that most Americans had never heard of, much less felt they had any national interest in. The CIA's military escapade was bad enough, but on examining documents, the committee discovered that the 40 Committee appeared not to have met or voted on the operation. In fact, internal documents showed that the CIA and the State Department had turned the project down 3 times in the previous 2 years. It turned out that during a trip overseas, President Nixon and Dr. Kissinger had met alone with the head of a foreign government. At that man's request, the administration had involved CIA in an internal war in the head of state's neighboring country. John Connally, on the verge of heading Democrats for Nixon, was sent back to the foreign leader, apparently to bring him the good news of final approval. A month later, after training for the project had already begun, 40 committee members were sent a memo by Dr. Kissinger informing them, for the first time, of President Nixon's decision. In a separate matter, this committee was told by former CIA Director Richard Helms of a decision to undertake a covert action project in Chile. Mr. Helms had been called into the Oval Office and told by President Nixon with Dr. Kissinger and Mr. John Mitchell present, that he was to undertake the project in spite of CIA reservations. He was also told, quote, not to inform the other members of the 40 Committee, end quote. A pattern was emerging. Not all covert actions were generated by the CIA. In particular, paramilitary operations of the worst type seemed to come from outside the CIA. Some projects came from the president. Some projects came from his Assistant for National Security Affairs, and some had their beginning in the Department of State. 40 committee records were subpoenaed to see if the pattern was valid. The subpoena was limited to the official document by which a covert action was approved. These records were often no more than one paragraph long. What arrived in response to our subpoena showed nothing, because it was mostly deletions. The deletions came in all shapes and forms. Typically, there would be one line left on a page saying, quote, a CIA project was telephonically approved, end quote, or, quote, the committee voted to approve a CIA paper entitled, title deleted, end quote. Often, if there had been numerous items considered at a meeting, the deletions themselves had been cut and pasted together. For example, item 8 might follow item 1, giving the impression that only 2 items had been considered that day. Sometimes there would be only one word left on a page, Chile, nothing else anywhere, but it was still classified top secret. The information, needless to say, was worthless. Wholesale deletions were encountered in the committee's investigation of domestic covert activities as well. COINTELPRO, the FBI's program for disruption of the New Left, like nearly all FBI actions, was extremely well documented. The committee requested the appropriate documents in July. What it received were summaries so heavily excised as to be unusable. One memorandum, for example, referring only generically to the New Left, contained the subheading Recommended Procedure on one page and Results on the next. The pages were otherwise blank. Another document with the same type generic reference, Blank Extremist Organization, was likewise excised in its entirety. The committee protested. Negotiations followed. Finally, in mid-October, an agreement was reached whereby less excised memos were made available to committee staff at FBI headquarters. The committee persisted, selecting a representative number of memoranda to be delivered to its own offices. After some delay, they were delivered, still excised. Requests for the documents pertaining to FBI national security wiretaps led to a similar experience. One set of documents was delivered, excised beyond use. Negotiations took place for almost a month. Finally, a second set of documents was provided, but again, without identifying targets of electronic surveillance. 6. Privileges. The second Kissinger subpoena brought even less than the first one. For the first time in the history of the Ford administration, executive privilege was invoked. The subpoena which caused this historic assertion was directed to Dr. Kissinger as Secretary of State. It was intended for the purpose of examining the type of covert actions recommended by the State Department since 1965. The State Department reported that it had recommended only 8 projects. This was later changed to 16 and still later to 20, but that none of the documents could be provided to the committee. Although only a few of the recommendations were from a Secretary of State to a president, all documents were being withheld because they were deemed privileged communications with presidents. They included recommendations from lesser state officials to the staff of the National Security Council, with no apparent intention that the document be for the eyes or the use of the president. In all cases, the communication did not take place in this president's administration. All privileges recognized by law are controlled specifically and personally by the person whose communication is being protected, and this president was not in that position as to the documents. It must be noted, again, that no other intelligence agency of department withheld recommendations for covert action or anything else sent to the National Security Council. If they had, the committee's work would have come to a halt. In any event, nothing came forth from the State Department. At no time was there a legitimate question as to which documents the committee was seeking, under either this subpoena or the subpoena for 40 committee documents. At no time was the physical amount of paper a problem, since only a few hundred sheets of paper were at issue. At all times, this committee, as well as the Congress, had a right, and in fact an obligation under law, to review the information at issue. With no other recourse, the committee cited Dr. Kissinger for contempt on November 14, 1975. On November 20, 1975, the committee approved a report to the House of Representatives asking that the committee's contempt citation be supported by the House itself and referred to the U.S. Attorney for prosecution. Contempt proceedings began to produce results with respect to the 40 committee records. Revised editions with fewer deletions were soon provided. Nothing came forth from the State Department. The committee then entered its last 2 weeks of hearings, having endured more than 3 months of uninterrupted delays, cutoffs, silenced witnesses, amalgams, attacks, deletions, and privileges. Finally, the evening before the committee was to take a contempt citation of Dr. Kissinger to the floor of the House for a vote, the committee was given access to State Department recommendations for covert action. 7. More delay. The third so-called Kissinger subpoena was intended for the review of Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, SALT, intelligence handling, but brought instead a return to the delay. What is SALT, and why was the committee so interested in the intelligence aspects of it? Briefly, SALT covers the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreements signed with the Russians in 1972 to limit the arms race. The agreements specifically limit such things as missile production, deployment, and testing by the United States and the Soviet Union. The ability of our intelligence services to detect whether the Russians are violating this agreement is of vital strategic interest. More important, SALT intelligence must be able to move through channels, uninfluenced by bias or ulterior motives, to appropriate decision makers. The committee had earlier received testimony that, during the Vietnam War, a desire to please high-level officials may have caused some intelligence to reflect what the upper levels wanted to hear. Vietnam is history, but SALT is not. To check how intelligence was being handled at the highest levels and whether it was ever withheld from top executive officials or Congress, the committee subpoenaed all reports on Soviet compliance that had been sent to the National Security Council. At first, committee staff went to the White House and was given a few SALT monitoring reports. These, it was said, were absolutely all that the National Security Council had in its files on the subject of SALT compliance. It did not seem possible. For one reason, the verification panel, which exists primarily to review SALT matters, is part of the National Security Council and has been quite active. For another, the committee had already identified dozens of pertinent documents from the intelligence community which had been sent to the National Security Council. The skepticism proved accurate. After committee proceedings to cite Dr. Kissinger for contempt of the SALT subpoena, on November 14, 1975, volumes of SALT intelligence material began to come forth. A week had passed since the return date of the subpoena before the documents the committee needed were even identified, making preparations for hearings most difficult. This was the last of the subpoenas, however. In reviewing the oversight experience, access to information, even when it was backed up by subpoena, was not satisfactory. As an example, at the State Department, we found that lower-level officials had eventually been ordered not to testify before the committee. Their documents were likewise refused to Congress. Upper-level officials at state have become inaccessible because of executive privilege, and diplomatic exchanges, an important element of intelligence, were similarly off-limits to the committee. To place the importance of this in perspective, intelligence has two primary consumers: military and diplomatic. Diplomacy is preferable to war, yet it is nearly impossible today to evaluate how well intelligence serves diplomatic ends. If it does not serve well, it is hard to imagine how anything could be known or done about it by Congress. The passion for confidentiality and secret at state is curious, because in many cases the Russians and other adversaries were either directly informed of the same secrets the committee sought, or the Russians knew of them by other means. It is hard to imagine a justification for allowing the unelected to keep elected officials in the dark in a democracy. 8. Routine problems. When legal proceedings were not in the offing, the access experience was frequently one of foot-dragging, stonewalling, and careful deception. A few examples should suffice. The president went on television June 10, 1975, and reassured the nation that the uncompleted work of the Rockefeller Commission would be carried forward by the two intelligence committees of the Congress. The files of the commission, President Ford announced, would be turned over to both committees immediately. The committee began requesting those files within the week. We requested and requested. We negotiated. Finally, by threatening to announce publicly that the president's word had not been kept, the files were turned over in mid-October, some 4 months late. In another case, likewise involving basic research information, the committee in early August requested a complete set of what has become known as the family jewels. This 693-page document was the very foundation of the current investigations. It had come into existence as the result of an order by former CIA Director James Schlesinger on May 9, 1973, in the wake of Watergate revelations. Dr. Schlesinger had ordered CIA employees to report any possible past wrongdoing, and those reports were compiled into the jewels on May 21, 1973. By the end of August, the committee had been provided only a sanitized version of the document. Letters were sent, and negotiations proceeded throughout September. On October 7, 1975, the staff was told that they would not be allowed to see the complete record of wrongdoing as assembled in May 1973. A second, sanitized version was sent in mid-October, but it was hardly less sanitized than the first. As an interesting sidelight, the second version did have one page that was not in the first. It was a photocopy of a Jack Anderson newspaper article, nothing more. In the first version, that page had been blanked out with the message, "This information deleted because it reveals sensitive operational techniques and methods." The second version was not deleted, but it was classified. The chairman demanded a complete copy of the report and was told that one would be forthcoming. None was. As a result, he scheduled a press conference for 12 noon on October 11, 1975. At 11:45 a.m. on October 11, 1975, the report was finally delivered, after the life of the committee's investigation was more than half over. These two examples represent some of the most basic research materials available to the committee. Their contents were crimes, abuses, and questionable conduct, not sophisticated or legitimate intelligence secrets. Other important information was withheld, such as a committee request for certain records of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. On August 25, 1975, a letter was sent asking for a copy of the board's agendas since 1961. No written response to that letter has ever been received. The board interested the committee from the standpoint of command and control. There have been numerous recommendations, for example, that a pending executive reorganization make this group the key command and control unit for foreign intelligence. The committee is still waiting for the board's documents to be delivered, despite the fact that the ranking minority member of the committee took a personal interest in the matter. A month of his efforts produced only a limited right to see certain information, not the documents themselves. Another important piece of information the committee requested was the names and relationships of newsmen who worked for both the CIA and the American news media at the same time. Congressman Dellums asked for this in executive session on August 6, 1975. The information was re-requested by letter on October 14, 1975, and on October 16, 1975, and on October 21, 1975, and on October 22, 1975. The committee is still waiting for answers about the newsmen. The only information it did receive was in response to inquiries about specific newsmen, after we had determined from other sources that there was a CIA connection. In fact, in one case, the CIA denied the relationship until confronted with irrefutable proof. As a final example, there is a category of intelligence that is sent to the Secretary of State, who then controls its further dissemination. It is called Notice Cherokee. He specifically requested Notice Cherokee information with reference to the Cyprus crisis in 1974. It was told that none existed. 2 months later, other officials revealed that the materials do exist. When the committee went back to state with this new information, it was simply told Notice Cherokee was not going to be given to us. By then, there was no time left to issue a subpoena. A. The right question. Perhaps the most difficult problem in developing information about intelligence activities is knowing the right question to ask. As an illustration, committee staff obtained the names of CIA proprietaries after lengthy negotiations. Sometime later, staff members noticed that certain names were not on the list. The explanation was that those were fronts, and we had not asked for fronts. Nor was this sort of semantic contest confined to staff inquiries. In one public hearing, Congressman Stanton and the FBI's Raymond Winall consumed more than 5 minutes drawing distinctions among surreptitious entry, burglary, and illegal break-in. 5 minutes compares favorably with the weeks it took committee staff to obtain precise answers to the difference between FBI informants and confidential sources. Another example grew out of a committee investigation of a covert action project that had taken place some years ago. This particular project was the subject of unusual interest by the committee, both because of the country involved and because it entailed tampering in the free election of an allied nation. The committee's objections to the project were strong enough that it voted to recommend to the president that the project no longer be kept secret. Astonishingly, while the committee was in the midst of objecting to this past project, CIA was obtaining approval for reinstituting the same type of project in the same country. The CIA never told the committee about this renewal. When newspaper revealed the new project, committee staff asked the CIA why it had not been told. The response was, "You didn't ask the right question." Time and again, a question had to be repeated and variously repeated. Only then would the sought-after facts emerge, even though the intent of the questions had been readily apparent. The operable ground rules were, as one official put it, quote, "After all, we're not a Coke machine. You don't just put in a quarter and expect something to come out." End quote. Examples of the difficulty in asking the right question are a bit like trying to prove a negative. The full impact may not be possible to illustrate. It was, however, the most nagging factor in attempting to exhaust the items that deserved congressional insight. The significance of that is that it reflects an attitude which cannot be expected to change, and as long as that is the case, ready access to documentary evidence and primary source material is all the more imperative. B. Congress and the secrecy dilemma. Classified information presents a classic paradox. Without it, government sometimes cannot function. With it, government sometimes cannot function. Spy agencies cannot publish details about their operations. At the same time, Congress cannot fail to report to its constituents about abuses of their government. What it all means is that there must be a responsible system of classification, accompanied by an equally responsible and effective system of declassification. We have neither. It has been easy to create secrets, but this government has yet to construct an adequate way to handle the problems too many secrets create. We have no Official Secrets Act, which would make it a crime to publish secrets, because such a law would be unconstitutional. Therefore, the only real enforcement of classification is sanctioning those who depend on access to secrets, such as Congress. Congress can be, and has been, either cut off from classified information or convinced to receive secrets selectively. This is only the beginning of classification problems. The law says that there are to be only 3 categories of classification: top secret, secret, and confidential. In spite of this, intelligence agencies spawn all sorts of higher classification, such as code word or compartment categories. Just as often, information is simply withheld from Congress under ad hoc arrangements. This committee was frequently told that, whereas its mandate was legal authority to receive classified information, that was not enough. 1. Oaths and agreements. The first matter of business between the CIA and the committee was a request by the agency that all of the staff be required to sign 6 pages of CIA oaths. These elaborate oaths stipulated, in effect, acceptable conduct for congressional employees with respect to things CIA had determined were secret. Without oaths, secrets would not be forthcoming. The staff represents, of course, committee members, but the members were not asked to sign oaths. Perhaps this was because members would not do anything untoward with secrets. More likely, it was because they would protest loudly about signing executive oaths. The committee reminded CIA that subjecting our employees to executive oaths would violate the concept that Congress is an independent and co-equal branch of government. It is the constitutional responsibility of Congress to control its own staff, and this is the course the committee followed. It required every employee to sign a statement drafted by the committee reflecting the needs and considerations of the Congress and enforced by Congress. This may seem like so much posturing, but it is important not to underestimate the significance of firmly establishing the premise that a target of an investigation does not lay down ground rules. As the agency noted, this has not been the case in the past, and it may be one of the reasons this investigation had become necessary. The next move was to require the committee to enter into agreements. The proposed agreements outlined certain categories of information so sensitive that the committee was to agree in advance not to see them. When this was rejected, a modified version of those agreements set forth proposed rules and regulations the committee would abide by if certain classified information were to be made available. These agreements also included a proposal to compartment our staff. Compartmenting would mean dividing them up and restricting their access to each other's work. The committee refused to sign. It refused even to agree, as a matter of understanding, that executive rules would be binding. Such proposed understandings included allowing intelligence officials to review the notes of investigators before notes could be brought back to committee offices. Other committees have consistently been subjected to that arrangement. The FBI proposal was even more restrictive than CIA's. Secret documents would be made available in special rooms at the FBI with FBI monitors present. Notes would be reviewed by FBI agents. After notes had been appropriately sanitized, they would be sent to our offices. Once again, the committee refused to sign. It did agree orally to put all future requests for documents in writing. The repercussions of this oral agreement illustrate quite nicely the problem with agreement. A few days later, the committee received a letter from the Justice Department stating that requests for materials that had been made a month earlier by committee members in public hearings had not been fulfilled. Even though FBI officials had publicly agreed to furnish the documents promptly, the requests had not been in writing. While the committee was negotiating an end to the cutoff from classified information, another agreement for handling secrets was proposed by the executive. The committee was asked to agree that certain categories of information be inaccessible. Other categories would be available only to senior members by means of selective briefings. Again, it was not agreed to. 2. Selective briefings. Soon after the opening hearings, staff began investigating a high-risk secret program. A request was made to interview the official in charge of the program. The interview was granted, but the official refused to talk about the program. He sat with a thick book of documents, but he refused to let any documents be reviewed. They were, quote, too secret, end quote. Intelligence officials made a proposal the committee would hear again and again. The chairman and perhaps the ranking minority member could be briefed on the program. In light of the fact that the committee had been told that clearances or secrecy categories would not be used to block the staff's work, it protested. When the chairman refused to be briefed alone, intelligence officials relented and allowed staff to have access to the information, so long as the chairman was briefed first. A second example illustrates the problem with selective briefings. The committee inquired into a project that included foreign military assistance via the CIA. It was too sensitive to discuss with staff. Once again, intelligence officials asked to brief the chairman and senior members. The full committee and staff were briefed, and the consensus was that the project had turned out to be one of the more outrageous ventures by CIA. Some months later, this same project was the subject of a committee action to ask the president that the full story be made public. A recent CIA operation in Africa followed the same awkward course of senior member and senior staff briefings first, then full and prompt disclosure to the committee. This committee consistently maintained this policy that everything told to senior members was promptly told to the full committee. If Congress wanted a one- or two-man committee, it had every opportunity to set one up. It has not done so to date. Preventing this from happening de facto was and is a serious challenge. 3. Special restrictions. Committee members are not the only object of secrecy arrangements proposed by intelligence officials. Other members of Congress apparently cannot be trusted with secret information about the government they govern. Time and again, staff was told that it would be difficult to turn over documents because of Rule 11. Rule 11 is a House rule that allows members of the House of Representatives to have access to all, quote, committee hearings, records, data, charts, and files, end quote. Despite committee rules protecting against dissemination of materials to other members, the committee was asked to sign letters affirming that it would not turn over documents to another member of the House. The committee was eventually asked to pass a resolution to that effect. Sometimes this acted to delay the forwarding of documents. The primary result was that most materials the committee received in the closing months of its investigation were, quote, on loan, end quote. The concept of loaning materials to the committee had other advantages for the intelligence community. The first advantage was the right to possession and control of final disposition of our files. Without a loan arrangement, staff was told that certain papers could not be provided. The other advantage in loaning documents pertained to a possible court contest over release of classified information. If release of a document were going to be legally disputed, the executive clearly wanted to be in the position of having legal possession of that document. Unfortunately, release or publication of committee information raised far more immediate and practical problems. 4. The release of information. One of the most troubling problems the committee faced was what information to release and what process to follow in making its decision. A corollary problem was what to do about unauthorized release of information. Existing standards for classifications are vague, arbitrary, and overused. Almost anything can be a source or method of intelligence, which are the primary criteria for foreign intelligence classifications. As a result, the sources or methods byline is used to classify items that have practically no bearing at all on intelligence, but are extremely embarrassing. Overuse of classifications is inevitable when, by the executive's most recent estimate, some 15,466 persons can classify information. The difficulty is that no one in Congress can declassify. The executive branch claims exclusive and sole jurisdiction. This gives an administration the power to use the classification system in a manner that can result in manipulation of news by declassifying information that can be used to justify policy, while maintaining classification of information that may lead to contrary conclusions. Another aspect to be recognized is that classification can hide conduct from the American people that is well known to the foreign country involved. Castro knew of the assassination attempts. The Cambodians knew they were being bombed, but the American people, whose government was engaging in these practices, were not aware of the activities because of the classification system. The dilemma arises when a congressman or committee receives information which one or the other decides should be brought before the people they represent. This committee faced that problem and did not reach a satisfactory solution. The procedure followed by the committee was that when it was decided to consider making public certain information taken directly from classified documents or testimony, it would give appropriate executive branch officials 48 hours' notice. It would then allow those officials to appear before the committee in closed session and present arguments against release of all or part of the information. If no agreement could be reached, the materials at issue would be forwarded to the president. They would be released unless the president asserted personally and in writing that release would be, quote, detrimental to the national security, end quote. The committee used this process with 3 separate pieces of information. All 3 were covert CIA projects. Their release was proposed in separate motions placed before the committee by Congressman Johnson. The initial Johnson motions were introduced in November 1975 and voted down by the committee, with 5 members not present. Some weeks later, the motions were made again, with all but 1 member present, and approved by the majority. This began the release of information process. The next step was to draft a short statement outlining the significant aspects of each covert operation. The statements were forwarded to the Special Counsel to the Director of Central Intelligence, with an accompanying letter notifying him of an opportunity to present the intelligence community's views in a hearing 3 days later. The Director of Central Intelligence, Mr. Colby, appeared, accompanied by appropriate officials, to present any specific objections he might have. His response was specific but sweeping. He objected to everything, no matter how it was worded, and no matter how impossible it would be to identify a country, a source, or an operational method. Mr. Colby's responses seemed to end any good faith efforts to work out mutually acceptable release of information, but the committee made one more effort. The 3 statements were rewritten, making them even more general than before. Names of countries were taken out, only gross dollar totals were used, and innumerable generic descriptions were inserted. In one case, far less remained than had appeared in newspaper articles attributed to high executive branch officials. In a hearing the next day, Mr. Colby still objected to the release of anything. 2 of the 3 statements were approved by the committee for release. This meant that all the materials had to be forwarded to the president for a decision on whether release would be detrimental to the national security. The president, of course, turned to CIA for guidance. More than 3 weeks later, the chairman was informed in writing by the president that the committee could not implement its decision to release the 2 statements. Incredibly, the president's letter was classified secret. The secret stamp was unnecessary because there were no facts at all about the covert projects in his letter. The types of projects at issue were not even mentioned. The letter was simply a rhetorical pronouncement of how important confidentiality is, and how telling the American people what their government is doing in these matters would harm our best interests. It should be noted that one of the items which allegedly would harm this nation's security if made public had already been made public by Dr. Kissinger. This is Our Hidden History